So my latest work is called Rootstalk, and it's written in 5 voices, some drawn from myth, others from historical accounts, but all reimagined. And the lives of these characters are shaped by the ghost orchid, or Epipogium phyllum, which spends most of its life underground and flowers every decade or so. And in Rootstalk, the ghost orchid becomes the point of search and of loss and longing and reconciliation. So the 5 voices are Persephone and Demeter, who are mother and daughter, May and Esther, who are lovers, and Cora, who is a young girl that weaves in and out of those stories. Persephone. To the dead, flowers are wreaths, or a curse of knotweed under their stones. Get me water and a vase. I'll show you the flower I picked before my season in the underworld. But there was no water, they said, and there was no vase. What you ask for, here they are words, not things. The shapes you can see, the shapes you imagine you can see, that you think familiar, are insects, gathering and ungathering. Get me earth, there must be earth. I'm talking to the buried. Demeter. In sleep, I see her planting a flower. I'm carrying her shoes, and the ground thistles are bursting. When I reach her, she is someone else's daughter, snipping the bloom from its ground thread. May and Esther. Out searching, and a warning cracks underfoot. Out again, and the trees lean in, until mud could be shade, and shade the shadow of a woman. It is the nature of woodland to be in on a secret. Botanists know this. Limitless damp for a shyness to root. Persephone. In the upper air, my mother walks to the place where the missing are called for. Parents with torches, a parked car by the lake, and everyone digging. Can you hear the summer drying under her hands? The wasted grass. At home, we'd search for mushrooms, wood ears, wax from elder trees. If I know my mother, she'll be out with forager's eyes, as if I might be curled at the base of a tree. Demeter. When I first put the land in place, I was everywhere at once. She was there for those fields, twinned to a sling of grain. Fields now panicked with dogs, and me crawling. Ask again how far I'd walk to find her. I'll walk everywhere at once. The depth of low-lying wetland, gardens of all lengths, stinking farmland, the meadows I sunk to peat bogs, purple spilt heathland, wintered locks. Cora. You shrink, and with small hands find small things. Nerve ending of lichen, digit of bone. In these stories, there's always a child who knows where to look. When you're older, you'll return to the same opening of fern, but for now, shaped to a fiddlehead, you are patience. Long wait for a flower to brave being seen. There are more women in the woods these days, heads down, muttering into their maps. and more than once, a woman asking the cops for her daughter. You don't talk to the trees round here. Unless you're young, then you might sing in the green world. Demeter. She has her back to me, the singing girl. If I knew the song, I could harmonise, and she would turn and be my child. But I don't, so she doesn't. Persephone. I've been thinking of names for it, trying them out like new pens. Ground rumour, found griever, grief foundling, ghost rumour, rootstock, rootstalk, ghost orphan, ghost orchid.
Leaves is a poem in 5 sections that loosely pick up on Eastern ideas of the elements: wood, fire, earth, metal, and water. Leaves began here in Richmond Park some 7 or 8 years ago, before the birth of my daughter, though I knew she was coming and she was imminent. And it tells the story through her development and her growth year on year as she enters into her own cycle of life and living in a place like this and all around her. And increasingly, the poem found a conversation around my daughter's conversation about her place on earth and the place of her parents. And I suppose one of the things the poem explores is exactly that conversation in relation between a parent and their child, and how you respond to that particular question about the continuation and the stopping of life.
Beam shiel on earthen, lifum lithen, liemu yenonian. A tree on earth must lose its leaves, the branches grieve. Maxims 1, 26-7.
Kicking up leaves in a lulled wood, when paths are covered underfoot, and a low rook claps at a loose dog, or a called name carries on the bare trees, as dry leaves flow from toe to heel, and slowed the mind unfastens from its rope, like a raft admitted to a current. Draped again on a childhood boat, watching the bowwater splice and seal at the stern. There and here, in one place and two. What child was unhappy with leaves at their knees, with red leaves tipping their boot tops, brown yellow leaves going in with their socks, or playful with planefalls to dunk in the hood of a duffel coat? But the wood is not yet your childhood, and out on a clearing, on the open slade, 3 hawks hang on unseen strings, and where the crack willows splay, like dancers spent upon their stools, their heartward open to audience, the young beams of a brocket, kneeling in the grass beyond the knot, so close his breath was felt before his bray announced him. 4 times he rose and roared, my ribcage belling. I thought that all that stood between us were those trees. Beth, Luish, Fen, Shayla, call out the billy witch, call out the thunder. Nian, Dua, Chinya, call out the oak ox, call the horse pincher. Something has stirred in the self-same wood, in the woken wood, the altering wood. Something has slipped in the semblance, like someone in their autumn coat who changes just their gloves each day. What falls is not forgotten, but in time drawn back through the bole and the branch in the annual abscission, all in time returned to time. I know what time is until you ask me. Fire will be found in the wood, and the earth fed by fire ash, and the metal forged will enrich the water so the wood may drink before it is given to fire. These are the phases, 5 roots and 4. These are the states of change.
As the first snow blazed over Antrim, as London waited for winter, your mother locked in the unlit wards of Isleworth, long beneath her landslide, your father lost to the unmanned miles of corridor. Into this you came, furnace to flame, dear, dear one, beloved, friend. Frost shall freeze, fire melt wood, earth grows, ice bridges, and water wears a helmet of glass to shield its new-made life. And a worn mind slips to a fire pit in childhood, wet lines looped on a cool lawn, a wheelbarrow ferrying its deadwood and leaf break, those moss-run bones of broken branch, having no more and so more to give. Cloak, smoke, barely blaze, though flukes rose up through the copper beech leaves, as if they had somewhere to be. Out with my dad in the scarfed cold, wondering where the burnt wood goes, and ash is what cannot be taken. Potash, phosphate, calcium carbonate. I don't even know where your ashes are. But all that they are is in everything. All that they are, I am. And the embers were never an ending, but the start of our investment in the chemical earth. The wood is the spring and the fire is the summer, and the earth our late long summer. Ore brings autumn, winter bears water. We are the watering wood. Your house was built before you were born. The earth was yours before you were your mother's. But it was not prepared, and its depth was not measured, and no one has said how long it should be. Now someone shall bring you to where you must go. Now you shall be measured, and after you, the earth. A red buck swam in the cold pen, and breached the bank 10 yards ahead, his hot flanks steaming from the sharp lake. He was a wonder of intimidation, all muscle and sinew and territorial pull. I took the ground between him and your pram, certain he would run us through. But chill had placed a tremor in his knee. I stepped to him. He turned at heel. Round and round the deer and the hound, where nothing is lost but sent to ground. Maybe it would be better to be a baby, so you didn't have to know. A tree on earth shall lose its leaves, but the wood that held us holds us, and the moment we stood in is standing. So the wood now is not the wood then, advancing like a tireless queen, its roof of new hours and axes. And the wood then is not the wood now, but a hearth of continuous elsewhere, a heap of earth, a slipped balloon, hot prints lifting off the warm stone, kicking through leaves, a callable common in one place and in two. Somewhere ahead of where we are, we are. Somewhere behind of where we are, we also are. I was there with you now. I am here with you then. The park gates close to reopen. What domineers diminishes. What destroys will injure the destroyer. By earth we see earth, by water, water. A power of the horses and the running of the deer, when the doorway darkens and the waves won't listen, and the oak night and the holly night duel. Don't leave me wherever you go, and we won't, until. We could never go back to the watering wood. We go back.
Song for Two, Apis Apis. Two birds discuss what it is to be birds, how heaviness would feel if it were possible, what light it is that blooms over them. Boomerang moons, their wings whisper to the dark. Now a nick, now a cut, now a curve. They carve through the night with white threads in their beaks. Little whittlers, sky calligraphers, air chasers who screech into the morning. Their lives are a complete act of faith that someone will hear and someone will answer. A note will open a note. What happens to your heart? It goes like this. You will be floating. Your skin will become thirst. Submerge your face. A metamorphosis starts. Blood retreats. Heartbeat slowing. Your mind an almost state. If you choose, dive. The transformation grows. You become water, mammalian. On land, the equivalent pressure kills. For the first few feet, your lungs are buoys. Afterward, contracting air shrinks you. Go deeper. You swim into a gravityless space. Here is where the ocean stops pushing you away. Further, the pressure trebles. The master switch kicks, your heart ticks even slower. Below, it plummets, 14 beats or lower. You should be unconscious. Your chest size halves. Organ walls work as release valves. Now turn back up. everything switches, reinflates, races. You are land again, of and on. Your heart broke laws. The light in the winter forest. The light in the winter forest is low as an animal. It breaks around the trees like a prism, white, pearly, almost smoke. The long firs seem to stand in it. It all has the feeling of a 3 a.m. nightclub when too much has been taken or drunk or both, and everyone stops, their backs toward you facing the booth, the strobe scanning them, waiting for the fall, that tribal, terrible surrender of a body dancing to earth. Movement so slow it looks like ticking. In Bavaria, a friend calls it Brecht, that fractal fan of light that strikes the woods into the water. I think of the sparse prosody and the leaping runway, the leaping, disappearing runway, and all the hours ahead. Watching the nest box. To hold a dying bird in your hand is like holding an argument. Hot flat fly thudding, hot scuffle of feathers, all angles and escape, a body flooded, bolting. Its feathers peek between your fingers, black reptilian tongues. A breath, a breath, a breath. Put it in your mouth like a naughty dog. Hot flat fly thudding, hot scuffle of feathers. I watch them opening. Newborn swifts look more like they're dying, mid-treatment. Halflings, gonad skin, pathetic feather fluffs, scratchy old horrors, hot flat fly thudding, hot scuffle of feathers. Then, when the nestlings' needles come in, it's a kind of trauma watching them. But when they fledge, they move more like fish, lifting as if falling doesn't exist. So when the first has its second birth, swims itself out from the nest, swings like shot. Oh, it's love. It's love. Sea cucumbers. I go to the sea when I'm lousy with sleep, startled, half dreaming, beneath, 1 part waking to 3 parts deep. Tonight I walk down to the harbour, past the cat calls, the men, the neon takeaways, great thighs of kebab meat pivot in lit windows. I push my body down into the water to hide under the cuff of the waves, lay, arms folded, watching fish turn their silver. I am their inmate, drifting over them as we roll. We blow and are a kiss blown back. Through a blur of spit in my goggles, I study leopard-spotted sea cucumbers. Fat, thick, huge as porno cocks in the greasy water. I see one pour itself into a rock, unchaining its skin, liquefying. When I surface, the men spill over the harbour wall. I recall a film I saw accidentally when I was 8, where a woman gets gang raped on a pinball machine. The harbour men flick their cigarettes, staring, starting down the steps. Disco lights pucker, slip. Everything is inconsistent.
Redreaming Sylvia Plath as a queen bee draws connection between the aerial poems of Sylvia Plath and the esteemed bee science of her father, beekeeper Otto Emil Plath. This reading of Plath's poetry and its closeness to a science examines how science can disturb the tenets or existence of what it seeks to know through a methodology of intervention, and by turn offers a reading of how art can seek to calibrate a residual energy of distress through a process of vital experience, activating poetry as a healer of science, discovering science as a pre-life of poetry. Redreaming Sylvia Plath as a queen bee, for Catherine Maguire. My first connection to Sylvia Plath, as a deep reader of her work, was as a beekeeper and as someone simultaneously involved in the problem of writing poetry. Oddly, my own first bees and their queen had died on the 10th of February, the eve of the anniversary of Plath's suicide. So my final portrait of the queen became a retrospective homage to Plath. Whilst rereading Plath's poetry, her bee poems in particular, I happened to be on my way from Galway to Blackrock in South Dublin. On the bus I looked up the work of Sylvia's father, who I knew had been a scientist and published a book. 3 copies of his book were listed for sale, 2 in the United States and 1 with its dust jacket intact for sale in Blackrock, where I was headed. The shop was closed, so I left a message. The next morning the bookseller phoned. He had the book in his hand. "Are you near?" I was. Soon, in the book-lined gloom of the shop, I held the rusty image of a queen bumblebee on a willow flower in my hands. Lifting the dust jacket, I saw an electric blue book-cloth binding, a single silver bee embossed at its centre. Inside, on the first page, I read a frail line in black ink, with the compliments of Otto E. Plath. A portal revealed itself suddenly. Contact had been made. The hands that had held Plath, that had studied and written about bumblebees, had also held this book, and had inscribed it too. The problem behind much of Plath's poetry, we are told, is the father, and here he was. The newfound book was more than merely talismanic. It was to become instrumental to my rereading of the writings and poems of Sylvia Plath, as resonant with and informed by her father's preoccupation, his scrutiny of details, rhythms, and behavioural traits in the insect world. In a roundabout way, my piece here has become a redreaming of Sylvia Plath's work through an examination of certain traits emergent in her aerial voice, the voice of her final devastating poems written in the last 7 or so months of her life, and its background, its murmurings, which could be found scattered more generally through her earlier poems and across her novel The Bell Jar, published shortly before she died in 1963. I am suggesting here that a look at Plath's father's work on bees, as an eminent bee scientist, and, indeed, at his work's infiltration into Plath's creative life, or life course, work course, can enable such a redreaming to occur, one which places at its centre the bee. Plath's bee dreaming starts with the evolution and achievement of her dead father's dreaming. It is the nearest she can get to him, to be as the thing he watched, the thing that he carried in the hollow of his hand. In ways, her dreaming purpose is the antithesis of his dreaming purpose, though both perhaps begin in love and develop an ability to see big powers working at a scale of minutiae, just on the fringes of human experience. As the German artist Joseph Beuys states, for language to be transformative, it first has to be transformed. And each in their way, Plath and her father, both equally self-constructed but to different pitches and ends, sought to transform their fields of attention to an enriched vision. The honeybee queen does not hibernate, but is kept warm through the winter in a protective, globe-like shelter of daughter workers, whereas the queen bumblebee of her father's focus digs herself into a small hole in the ground and hibernates there. The ground freezes about her, but she remains warm, having mated and fattened over the midsummer. She sleeps for around 7 months, emerges in the spring, builds a nest in the ground or in the hollow of a tree, within which she builds a honeypot of wax in front of a small brood comb for her offspring and first workers. She constructs a groove upon this in which she settles to incubate her brood, sipping honey from the honeypot. Most of her life is lived in drowsy numbness, and then in darkness, being attended to by daughter sister bees. She has her excitement of flight and mating as a virgin queen, and then she hibernates. She then has her work cut out as a mother-to-be bee, foraging briefly and nest building. Twilight, and then she fades exhausted. The honeybee, meanwhile, often nests high up in trees. Bee scientists, like Plath's father, make a habit of opening trees and the earth into the ground to find such nests. Plath created a legacy that has been examined by scholars and enthusiasts in that cultish, obsessive way in which Otto, her father, sought to examine the life cycles of bumblebees, their behavioural patterns and phases of existence. We have to reach into Plath's inner hibernaculum to know her, just as by her process of writing she had to break into her own life source to write. Her poems come from the pieces of her nests, her honeypots, her larvae, her flights, her mating and fighting songs, just as her father dug bees from their hidden lives to know them. Hibernation is one of the phases in the life history of bumblebees which has hitherto received little attention, writes her father, and so he worked to uncover it. And Plath sought to immerse in the experience of it. Ariel is dramatic speech of a kind, writes Hughes. But to what persona and to what drama is it to be fitted? The poems don't seem to supply enough evidence of the definite sort. But the circumstances of her death multiplied every one of her statements by a wild, unknown quantity. The answer to this, via such a redreaming, is that the persona emerges as the queen bee within a ritualized drama, reenacting the wild state of bees, and that drama is focused towards the act of constructing the poem. What did Plath, as Ariel, do with her voice in the end? Exhausted as a woman, she set out a resemblance to the bumblebee's nest. Her children in their cots with milk and bread sealed off in a room. Her head on a folded cloth, sipping gas, as the bee sips honey, in incubation posture, now that her voice had no use for breath, or her wings much for flight. On the one hand, her voice entered a Hadean realm of bloodless, breathless text, those shadow figures we reach for as readers to reanimate. On the other hand, in preparation for her death, she put her Ariel poems in the safest place she could find, in a black spring binder on her desk. She pushed them, like a swarm of word energy, back into the grain of trees, into printed pages, into her final, most potent book.